always wanted to do a standing room only presentation, so you've made my dreams come true today. Thank you all for coming, and today we're talking about blurbs. And so basically all you gotta do is like write 200 words about your story and you're done. Yeah, it's just like that, it's no problem. No, but I want to talk a lot about, like, we're talking about how to dissect your book and analyze what's in your book and then pull out the pertinent, salient parts and then create your blurb out of that. So we're going to dig into that, we're going to dig into things not to do, and at the end of the day, you'll know everything. It'll be wonderful. You should go forth and create amazing words. So, I am Malorie Cooper. I write science fiction under MD Cooper, and I forgot that was the picture. It's me. I mean, like, are you guys surprised? Okay. Okay. So, this is my old title slide. What is this doing here? Anyway, the question's important, like, is it possible to have fun writing blurbs? I actually really enjoy writing blurbs. I have fun doing it. I love writing blurbs for myself. I love writing blurbs for other people, and I have a great time doing it. And I'm going to skip a little about me because I'm a person. I write books. I've written 127 books.
Wow.
And I've written blurbs for them all. I've written blurbs for about 400 or 500 other books on top of mine. So I've worked with a lot of authors on their blurbs. And my goal is to make it so that everybody can write a blurb for their book, because no one feels as passionately about your book as you do, and no one's ever going to get the emotion of your story and how much you care about it your blurb as much as you will. So I want everybody to be able to do it themselves. And then you can still hire someone else, you just know how to fix it afterwards. So this is the problem with blurbs. This is the mistake that we see in blurbs, just too much. I mean, there are other things too, but honestly, too much backstory. If you're writing about stuff that happened before the book starts, you're doing it wrong. I know, I'm sorry, it's such an absolute statement, but it's like 97% true. But there's also other problems, like too many names, no stated adversarial conflict, filter words and passive voice, we'll talk about what those are, and no risk of failure. I'm a very big believer in putting as few names as humanly possible into your blurb. One, if you can get away with it, if you're doing romance, you want to do 2 names and then that's it. Like, don't mention the Queen's name, the Captain of the Guard's name, and all that, because people are just going to forget the way the heck you're talking. It's like the Captain, the Queen, don't get doing that. So that's a great one, a great thing to do. Fantasy is the biggest offender here, right? Like, you've got like these, and not only are there too many names in fantasy, you can't pronounce any of them. So it's just like, this bounces right out of your brain. So this is what I hear a lot when I say that there's too much backstory in people's blurbs. People are just like, but the reader needs to know all of this stuff. They understand the characters' motivations. But they don't, they really don't. This is my answer. They do need to know these things, but inside the book, not in the blurb. So when I talk about backstory too, I'm talking about like your character maybe starts out in a new town, and they're starting a new job. And instead of starting with the character saying they're in a new town or starting a new job, you explain why they're in this new town. Their mom died, and their dog died, and they lost their job, and everybody hated them, and so they moved to a new town. Like, you don't need all of that. You just need to say, from here forward is what's happening in the blurb. Because it takes away from any urgency and immediacy of your story. Because you're going to use a lot of past tense. You're going to say was, did, had, and all of those words are going to separate the reader from any feeling of immediacy in the story. You, of course, will lose them in a sea of details. You have 200 to 300 words to make someone care about an imaginary character you came up with in your head, to spend 10 hours reading about them. So you really want to spend all of your effort making that emotional connection between the reader and your main character or main characters. And of course, the biggest thing that your blurb needs to contain is you need to convey your tropes, your character, and your setting, and the words that you decide what to fit on there. So that's what you really want to be doing in your blurb. So I have an example here. So this is an example of too much backstory. It's been 1,000 years since the veil was last broken. Years of peace, prosperity, and growth. Now that it come to an end with a fresh incursion from the Smugarians, the nation of blah blah, etc., etc., etc. Instead, you can say like a violent crack interrupted Amanda's mid-afternoon slumber. It only took an instant for her to realize the world would never be the same. A black splash crossed the slot sky to the east. The veil was torn. By the way, this is past tense. It should have been present tense. I keep meaning to fix that, but I'm like, it's a perfect example of how even I can write things in past tense when I shouldn't. But you can see between these two things, like the first one didn't even get to the action yet, right? Like we didn't even know what was happening. With this other one, I start right with action, and I'm conveying immediately this information. I've got my main character, it's Amanda, she's having an afternoon slumber. Clearly she lives a somewhat relaxed life. Her world would never be the same. I've already conveyed now that the status quo has been broken, and then I even say like what it was that broke the status quo. And we did all of that in just like 50 words or something like that. So that's the kind of thing you want to be doing. You want to start your blurb with the inciting incident if possible, and do that at the same time as you introduce the character and the status quo, within the same paragraph or even the same sentence if you can pull it off. And then from there you can start layering in the stakes. So when I mentioned before too many names, people oftentimes like a mix of people and places. You really want to try to avoid that. If you have like a city that's got a fancy name or something like that, you could just say the city instead of the city of XYZ, of Constantinople, which I guess, if you're writing actually that's a point you meant to make. If you're writing historical fiction, you might want to mention some sort of historical city that the story's set in, but if you're not, if the city itself isn't super important, you would skip that. And that's ways of keeping your blurb more concise and more readable and just more parsable for people as they're just sort of skimming through books that they might want to get. The thing that I see the most in blurbs that causes me to not want to read a book is that I don't learn who the antagonist is, and I don't learn who what the conflict is. A lot of blurbs really broadly state like, or they must overcome their internal struggle, or they'll never be able to save the day. And it's like, well, that's not really compelling information. What is the internal struggle? What is the demon that they're fighting? What's the thing that trips them up that causes the character to freeze and not be able to do the thing that they're going to have to overcome to finally get the result that they want to have? And you really need to be clear what that is, and you need to then hint at what the stakes are. Because without knowing what the stakes are for the character, I have no motivation to read about them. And actually really succinctly, what your blurb really needs to do, actually I don't have a slide for this, is what I'm going to say, is you need to establish the status quo, what breaks the status quo, what the character is going to do to bring back the status quo or to establish a new status quo, and what happens if they fail. And that's really what your blurb needs to be doing. Because that's what's going to hook people. That they're like, okay, this thing is broken, the character's now going to take these steps to resolve it, or to put themselves into a new place, and if they fail, terrible things happen, the sky collapses and everybody burns. I don't know, whatever it might be. So I need to do more funny. I've got enough laughs on you guys this time. I'm usually really fun, guys. I can do a dance. I ripped my dress while I was going to the bathroom too, so I can't do that much dancing. Right? I've been waiting for this dress for years, and I ripped it right away. It's okay, it's on the seam, so I can glue it back together, but there is also the risk that the dress could just completely unzip, because latex will do that, and I'll just be standing here naked, so. I signed myself up for this sort of thing too, right? All right, so let's talk about making words pull in their weight. Every word you speak needs to matter, and your prose needs to shine. I discovered, this actually is both true for blurbs and for ads, I discovered that people actually judge the prose in your ad as though it's the quality of prose that your book is going to have. I've made typos and stuff like that in my ads before, and people have made comments like, wow, this is as good as the author can write, the book must be terrible, because they're so nice. And when I realized, I'm like, oh God, my prose in my ads and my blurb really needs to actually reflect my writing style and the quality of writing that I'm going to do. And that's actually a really important thing too. Your voice and your character voice needs to come forward in the blurb. It can't be cold and clinical. But there are words called filler words out there that you really want to avoid. These are words that you actually should generally avoid using in your writing as well, because they separate the reader from the story, because now the reader has to make some sort of personal judgment about what those words mean to them. It's noticed, seen, saw, realized, felt, thought, wondered, believed, you decided. It's they noticed something, and you're like, well, how did they notice it? What you should be saying is their eyes darted to the side and they spotted a flash of red, or something like that. Or their gaze darted to the side. Eyes tend not to dart, so they're usually pretty fixed in the head. One of my editors is getting me all the time. She's like, no, it's their gaze, not their eyes that are doing these things. Their eyes cannot dart across the room. Right? We all have these little things, right? These little mistakes we constantly make over and over again. And eventually, there's if you do this one more time, I'm going to fly over and shoot you. Is it just me that's had my understanding? Good. Yeah. I feel like she would do it too. She's hardcore. But these are all words that they're called filter words. Some people call them filler words as well. But they separate the reader from the action or what you're trying to convey, and they make the reader now have to try and imagine how someone noticed something or realized something or saw something. When you could instead, show instead of tell, by showing what the character did, what their reaction was, convey information and stuff like that. So definitely avoid those words. All right. So I know we always talk about not using passive voice, and a lot of times people are like, it's kind of can be hard for somebody to identify what it is, and it's really just when the object being acted upon precedes the doer of these actions. Why is the F missing? My God, Malorie. You didn't know this. So the sword was pulled free by Jane. Jane pulled the sword free. The first one's in passive voice, the second one's in active voice. So really all it is you just have to have your subject before the action element in the sentence, and it becomes active. So that's kind of what you can look for. And of course, was and had don't always mean passive voice, but they're great indicators that passive voice is going on. So once you have that, once you've got you're concise, you're not putting a lot of names, you are not using filter words, you're getting right to the point. You really have to layer in what happens if everything goes wrong, and you need to make that really clear what the stakes are for this character. Clearly defined stakes are what creates a one-click blurb. And without relating to the reader what happens if everything goes wrong, you've really just written an intro to the story. You're just like, hey, I've got this character and they did this thing, they met this guy, and maybe love will happen. And you're like, yeah, that's like a prologue. That's not a blurb. That's not like telling me what the risks are, what happens if they can't get in or not get in. That was apparently thinking of romance or something like that. God. So the last thing is, do you have to write your blurbs to market? I know we're always taught about we have to write our books to market, but now you have to write your blurbs to market as well. And it was died inside when I said that. This is what you're all thinking, How do I do that? So we're going to break it down here. This thing just does not like my slides. So the first thing is your genre. Your genre is going to have expectations around how they expect the blurb to be written and the kind of things they're going to be in it. We can't read this, but things like, does your genre generally do first or third person blurbs? Do they do past or present tense? Almost all blurbs are in present tense, but some genres actually do tend to towards past tense blurbs. What tense is the book written in? What, on top of that, what gender are you writing for? Men tend to respond better to third person. Women tend to respond better to first person. Men tend to respond better to setting and plot-oriented blurbs. Women tend to respond better to blurbs that focus more on the characters and people. Not exclusively, it's a 60-40 kind of thing, but you want to think about that. Who is my audience? How do they like to take in information? Are they going to connect to a grand plot, or are they going to connect to a particular character's struggle? And you want to actually think about that a lot. You actually want to think about your perfect reader, your ideal reader, or even create a couple of them. Something that I actually do is I have on a Pinterest board, and I have pictures of people and their traits and interests and whatnot, and they're my ideal readers. And when I'm thinking about writing marketing copy, I'm like, okay, I'm writing this marketing copy for Jane. What does Jane relate to? And I sort of create these paragons of my readers, and I think about how I'm going to be writing copy for them and writing my blurb for them. And I actually even sometimes will change my blurb depending on the marketing activities that I'm doing. If I'm doing a bunch of marketing, a lot of Facebook ads targeted at women to try and bring more female readers into my series, I'll alter my blurbs and I'll make some of my blurbs first person instead of third person. And then if I change, I'm doing really heavy ad spend marketing towards men, I'll actually change my blurbs to third person blurbs and change the content about them to be more plot oriented. So that's this next one. But people do need to know about your characters, and you need to basically set the stage, but you really need to introduce your readers to just your main character or your two main characters if you're writing romance. And if you're writing RH, you have a lot of characters to introduce them to. That gets tricky. Some people, what they'll do is they'll actually write a paragraph for each of the love interests in the RH. Some people just write a third person blurb so they can sort of easily describe all of them. And a lot of times too, even if you are writing RH and you have say 3 or 4 characters, well probably at least 4 characters, you can still go in and sort of maybe just broadly describe some of them. You could say say you've got the cowboy, you've got the bartender, and you've got, the UPS driver, or something like that. You could also describe them by more generic terms sometimes if you're worried that you're just you might be losing your readers in a sea of names. And honestly too, if I have to think about John, Jeremy, and Jeff, all J's, don't do that either. That would be hard for people to figure things out. It's a lot harder to tell them apart, but I would be, in my mind, very easily be able to differentiate the cowboy, the bartender, and the UPS driver. So that's another way to think about like how you can separate your characters. Setting and plot matter a lot, and different people are attracted to different types of stories, obviously. And you need to think to yourself, like, what are the words that people are looking for that signify these things? Romance really has it nailed down because, like, the major tropes in romance just have common words that people use all the time. You know, enemies to lovers, dark mafia, bully romance, and whatnot. And you can sometimes just put those words right into your blurb. But you can do that with other ones too. Like when I'm writing my science fiction blurbs, I'll actually use words like epic and space exploration and discovery and stuff like that. And these are all words that will trigger certain genre expectations and tropes with my readers as well. So I'm really thinking about the words that signify, you know, the things that I want to read and the things that I know my readers want to read, surprisingly. I already wandered into tropes. I know a lot of people think that tropes are a bad word, but they're not, because that's what people are looking for. Readers read by trope. They're looking for these specific tropes. In my last presentation, when I was showing all of the book covers, I was showing how, like, I look for books that have, you know, big epic science fiction scenes on them, because that tells me that it's a far future science fiction, and I want to read far future science fiction. I don't want to read near future science fiction. And so that cover and then some of the things in the blurb will tell me that that trope is being hit. If they mention other planets, if they mention space travel and stuff like that, I'm like, okay, cool. They're hitting some of the tropes that I want to have, and you want to think about that. You know, that you're conveying those setting and trope elements. If you're writing, sci-fi romance, for example, and you want to convey that the characters have been abducted and taken into this intergalactic society versus being abducted and just taken to the far side of the moon or something like that, you want to make sure that you convey that, because there are readers who want to read about this, you know, this lost person in a romantic relationship in this foreign society that's this vast, expansive society or something like that, versus like something that's like a smaller scale. Some people might want to read a smaller scale thing where it's like a more intimate setting, and you want to make sure you convey either way which way those are going. So, and I know, like, this is a lot of information, and you're like, great now, but I still don't know how to, like, to tell the forest from the trees when I'm talking about my own book. I think it's the biggest problem with most authors. I'll say, like, what's your book about? And they start telling me about a character's backstory, and then about why they're doing something, and about that time that their dog did X, Y, Z, and whatnot. I'm like, that, none of this belongs in your blurb at all. And they're like, well, what belongs in my blurb? I'm like, well, what is your character actually trying to do? And it can be very hard to really figure that out and then concisely say that in one or two sentences. So what I like to do is I have people, this for some reason, this screen resolution size and my slides are not happy together. You want to identify your book's key elements. So I've created this pretend romance story here, and I've got two characters, Sarah Harding and Peter Ames. And I sort of just listed out Sarah's main attributes and Peter's main attributes and what they do for a living and stuff like that. Sarah's a software architect, because I'm a software architect, and it rocks, or I was. You know, logical, detail-oriented, but she's walled off. She's a closet romantic, but she's not letting anybody know, because in her job she's like surrounded by dudes who she has to constantly put up walls around. But she loves dancing if you get her a couple drinks in her, which is also a lot like me, actually. Peter is an interior designer. He's got an easy smile. I like to do something like, okay, the girl's like the hard executive, and the dude's like the foofy interior designer. There's some fun with this. He's obsessed with color synergy, as am I, actually. And we go sociable, right? No, I just made that up. It's not even on the screen. Loyal, honorable. So I just sort of listed some things out about my characters, some of their main tropes that I want to focus on. Then I think about my setting. Okay, it's going to take place in Salem, Massachusetts, Boston. There's an oceanside bar. There's a whale cruise, and it's New England. And these are actually all sort of key things, right? Like Salem, Massachusetts has a whole lot of stuff associated with it. And if they're hanging out there during October, for example, that's going to be like a major part of the story that I want to make sure I convey in the blurb. New England has sort of a whole feel and a vibe to it, the small town New England thing, you know, the 400-year-old town that's on the ocean kind of stuff, is a whole angle that a lot of people want to read about. So I want to get those setting elements in there, because there are people who will, you know, pick up a book because it has a setting that they like. And then my plot elements. Peter's designing a new office for Sarah's company. She's hard on a deadline. He loves being on the water. She's sworn off men focusing on her career. There's accusations of gold digging. And then some general tropes. Work weary, she's been alone for a long time, so is he. He's facing a business failure. Some romance, reverse millionaire, which isn't a thing. I just made it up for this. It should be a thing, right? I guess if you reverse millionaire, she wasn't a reverse millionaire. So then what I did is I thought about the genre that I'm writing in, and I took all of these different things I just jotted down for my stories, sort of thinking about what's going on, and I identified the ones that I thought were going to fit with this genre the most. And part of that was at the time I wrote this, I actually went and looked at some of the top books in the genre that I was mapping this to, and looked at the tropes that they were conveying, and said like, okay, like these are things that are strong, these are things that will convey what I want. So I mapped all of those out, and then I mapped out the things I thought were the most synergistic, things I could like string together in a blurb the best without having to have a lot of filler and transitional sentences and whatnot between all these different elements. And then I looked for the overlap. You know, where are the synergistic things in this blurb that also map to the genre right now, and came up with sort of a final list of things that I wanted to focus on for writing the blurb. And it gave me like sort of a much smaller list that I was then able to look at this and say like, okay, now how do I write a blurb that, you know, conveys this information? And nothing more than this. That's one of the secrets. Like that's where this is how you keep from writing about your character's dog that died as backstory. Like the dead dog is not in here. I feel terrible talking about a dead dog. I need to stop doing that. The rule is you don't kill the dog. What am I doing? It started off wrong. That's a funny side note. In one of my books, there's a family who lives in a starship and it's run down, and they're always trying to like get from point A to point B, and they adopt a dog, and someone said, this is not the safest starship in the universe. No one can destroy it because there's this little corgi on it. Right? You can't blow the starship with a corgi on it. So just to solve that problem, we got the corgi a spacesuit so that we could blow the starship. It's a little segue there. So this is the information now that I'm going to try and cram into a blurb. And some blurb do's. I talked about a lot of blurb don'ts, but I want to talk about some blurb do's. Write a blurb that you could imagine being read aloud while a trailer for your book plays. Something like, I mean, if you're writing about something, you know, like really action, like in a world, you know, you want to think of that, and actually like look at some of the trailers for movies that are that are doing well and that are in your genre, because you know, the words that they use, the pacing that they're going to be using, all that sort of stuff is something that is building expectations in the readership, and mapping to those existing expectations helps you out a lot. The shorter is not actually better. The most effective blurb size, I've actually seen a number of different studies talking about different lengths. It sits somewhere between 200 and 300 words. Because you really do need, like I said, you need to create an emotional connection between your readers and this imaginary person that you've come up with. And that's, by the way, the thing that people do relate the most with. People relate to people. So at the end of the day, if there aren't interesting people that the reader's going to like and relate to, unless it's horror has an entirely different set of rules that I don't understand. I understand them generally, I just don't understand how to make someone relate to everybody personally. But if you're into it, you probably do, so you go figure that part out. But you don't want to pad it. You don't want to like just throw filler in there. If you think like, I've told everything I can tell, and it's 180 words, that's great. Like, don't like kill yourself trying to make this thing a 200-word blurb just because I said so. And then yes, add in a call to action after your blurb. Don't just like end the blurb, like add in a thing, and if you were in my last class using some primer words, like, you know, jump in on this amazing adventure with John and explore the universe or something like that, or maybe I would word that better, but you get the point, you know. So always, don't just make it like, you know, click now to read or buy now or something like that, because those are really salesy, and those are actually going to break the emotional connection you just made with your reader by turning this into a financial transaction, and that's not what you want. You want to make it so that, like, sit down, I'm going to tell you a story, kind of thing. All right, so now we're going to talk about the anatomy of a blurb. I have 25 minutes left. Okay, good. I can do this, I swear. All right, so the first thing you have to do is you have to have your character, motivation, and setting. So I did kind of talk about this before. This is establishing the status quo. Who is your main character? What are they? And like, what's the setting? And you can do this really quickly. You don't have to make this a lot of work. Like if your character has a particular job in a particular location, a lot of times that can actually establish the entire status quo and a lot of things about the character. Like, is the character an airplane captain, you know, or something like that. You know, landing in Atlanta, which is what all airplane pilots do. You guys know that, right? There's this joke where even if you're in the South and even if you get sent to hell, you're gonna have a layover in Atlanta. I swear, it's insane. All right, but you want to have that. You want to introduce the problem, and you want to introduce what the solution is going to be, because the reader needs to know what they're reading toward. You know, they need to know, like, because readers are reading for a feeling. They want to be done your book and have a feeling inside of them. There's this one romance author, I should know who it is, some of you probably will. She was, I think she was at RWA, and someone came up to her and said, like, I really liked your last book, but it was so much like the book right before that. And she said, yeah, I really like that story. You know, because that's what the readers are doing. A lot of times they want to read the same story over and over again. They want some new elements to it. They maybe want like some new obstacles and like curious how you're going to get there. But really, they're just looking to enjoy the same story again. You know, whenever a new Star Wars movie comes out, we're like, this thing better give me the same feelings that the Star Wars movies that I liked gave me, and you're disappointed that they didn't, and you're sad and you cry a lot. But it's like that, right? Like that's what we're looking for. That's what your readers are looking for, and you really want to make sure that they understand that they're going toward that destination. I mean, romance, for example, is the obvious one. There has to be a happily ever after. If there's not a happily ever after, then you're going to have some upset readers with you. I mean, there could be a happily for now if you're doing a do-mentor series or something like that, but you really do need to get to that goal. And to be honest, for most of the things that we're writing, unless you're writing Japanese horror where everybody dies, we kind of know that the main character is going to do the thing that they're trying to do. So you really do want to you can give the reader hints about how they're going to do it, what the solution's going to be, or you can make it a red herring. It could be like just to seal the veil, a man is going to have to go on this magical quest and get the sword in the stone, which turns out the stone's just magnetized, and she just has to use a South Pole magnet to get the sword out. I had this conversation with my daughter where she's like, I was teaching her about magnets and how we first discovered magnets by banging iron against rocks. And she's like, what if Excalibur was just a magnetized rock? I'm like, that's really cool. I want to write that story. Anyway, and of course, then lastly, the obstacles and the penalty for failure, otherwise known as the stakes. All right, I already said this, but there it is. It's up there again. As you all know, I always bury the lead with my presentations. So let's talk about taglines. On top of all this other stuff, you need to have a killer tagline. It's got to be amazing. It's got to be one sentence or two really short sentences long. Ideally, when you look it on the screen on your desktop computer, it shouldn't go to 2 lines. Or if it does, like just barely. You want to keep this thing as concise as possible. This is a very trite tagline. The last thing Sarah wants is exactly what she needs. I probably wouldn't actually use this for real because like this has been used 1,000 times, but it gets the point across, right? Like it sets the stage that Sarah is this character who's closed off, walled off, and she doesn't want love. She doesn't want to have this emotional relationship. It's exactly what she needs. And to be honest, in a way, this conveys the entire plot of the story in one sentence, and that's kind of what you almost want to do if you can get away with it. Get as much in there as you possibly can. So now that I get my tagline done, I'm going to start writing this blurb. And the first part I'm going to do is setting up the status quo. And so I wrote this. This is an example of like a terrible version of this, which is usually what I write the first time, so it fits perfectly. Yet another Saturday in the office. When I'm trying to set the stage, she's working Saturday. She's obviously working overtime. She doesn't want to be doing it because I'm using the words yet another. She was used to working 6-day weeks when the boss dumped yet another. I used yet another twice. Don't do that. It's a great example of what not to do. High-profile project on her lap. She wondered if it might be time to set up a cot in her office or find a new job. Something establishing how dissatisfied she is with her work. Her noise deep in the trip to the coffee maker brought her face to face with interior designer sizing up the break room. So, I mean, this does give me like the beginning of the story. I'm like at the starting point of the story. I've established the status quo, introduced both main characters, but it's kind of long, right? Like that's a lot of words just to say that sort of thing. And there's a lot of unnecessary details in there. Like my wife is like Jill. She's like the blurb slasher. She would come and cut that thing down in one sentence. But we're going to move on for now, and we're going to. Actually, no, I rewrote this right here. Okay, this is the slide we're doing. All right, when Sarah literally bumped into interior decorator in the company break room, the last thing on her mind was getting to know him. After all, she wasn't working on the weekend because she loved spending days off in the office. So that top paragraph right there is conveying all the information that this entire last slide did. Oops, not this one. Go back one more time, you can do it. There we go. Like all of that information is now conveyed just in that first paragraph. And that's something that happens a lot when I write blurbs. I'll like write a relatively wordy thing, sort of like trying to establish my status quo or my setting, and I'll pare it down. And what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to show as much of the character's motivation, their status quo, and their frustration with whatever problem is happening, or whatever the inciting incident maybe is in as few words as I can. But when she saw that he could refill the coffee pot, this mysterious man, on the second look, I'm kind of giving a hint, it's an interest and curiosity, and I'm adding a to him. And then I'm going to switch into identifying Peter. He was also bringing the candle both ends, working several jobs in order to keep his fledgling company afloat. After running into him this is where I got sort of like I kind of hot-headed my blurb, which I should put that. After running into him 3 weekends in a row, she began to warm up the wiry, vivacious man. So I'm sort of layering in a little bit of their attraction to each other, and then the possible motivation. Again, this is all really long, and you're going to see how it gets pared down. Then he asked her out. Sarah's work schedule said no, but her heart said yes. The pair spent a gorgeous New England night on the Boston Harbor, which I've done. You can take these really cool boat cruises out there. But when she slept in and missed an important client meeting, she wondered if romance and her hard-won position could coexist. So that's where I'm layering in the conflict now. Like, this is the obstacle that she faces, is can she actually, work in this high stress world that she works in, and also like have the kind of romance that she wants to have. Then the solution is like, or the proposed solution is, in the past her job always won, but there was something about this quirky man. There's little tubes of color synergy sitting on it in there that had her considering turning her life on its head. So that is now sort of the end of this story, where we now know that she's, oh wait, no, there's a little bit more. This blurb is so long. What's I doing? Right, so this is the problem now. Right? She's layered in what she wants to do. She wants the guy, she decides she wants the guy, but can she throw everything out? And I also lay in some stakes at the very end. She's gonna have to decide fast because she's not the only person showing an interest in him. So that's now the final stakes, where if I'd ended before that, it was kind of like, okay, well, they're just gonna go on this relatively linear path and the thing is gonna happen. But now I've thrown an obstacle in it, thrown a monkey wrench into the mix. You could do this right at the end, you could do this a little bit sooner. So we've got the pieces of a decent blurb here, but this is it all together. It doesn't look quite as bad like this now, but it's still a lot, and it needs to be pared down. So there's a shorter version still. There we go. So this is a much more pared down version of this blurb. When she literally bumps into interior decorator of the company's break room, the last thing in her mind was romance. After all, she wasn't working a day off because she loves being in the office. And then we had some personality in here, because the initial version of the blurb was sort of just like it was just a fax man sort of thing. Didn't really have a lot of personality. Although when she sees these refilled coffee pot, this mysterious man earned major brownie points. He's easy on the guys, like really easy. And after running into each other 3 weekends in a row, he asks her out. Sarah's work schedule says no, but her heart screams yes. So that kind of like now gets a lot more information in there, and also adds this into the personality. The brownie points was from Jill. She added that, and she's really good at that. That's one of the, I can't take credit for that. I would never write major brownie points in my blurb, but she did. And I love it. That's also a great thing. Like your friends can help you with your blurb. Don't be ashamed of reaching out to other authors and saying like, hey, what's going on in this blurb? What can I do to make it better? It's actually also very easy for all of us to write blurbs for each other's books, because we're not lost in the forest like we are with our own blurbs. In her past, the job always took priority, but there's something about this quirky man who's a little too obsessed with color synergy. I just like that so much. It's probably dumb, but there it is. Something that has her considering turning her life on its head. But could she abandon her ambition and career for a man who could leave her at any moment? It sort of hints at past things that happened in her life before. She has to decide fast because Sarah wasn't the only woman showing interest in the annual designer. And also, this last version of the blurb, this is also like, when I did this presentation the first time, I gave it to Jill and she went through the whole thing and she's like, why is your blurb in past tense? And I'm like, damn it, it is in past tense. So this is the present tense version of this blurb as well, which adds some more immediacy to it. When you read this, it literally bumps into, you feel like you're right there with her, like the event is just happening. And that's what you want to do with your readers. You want to make them feel like they're like on your character's shoulder as everything's going on. So everything that you're doing as well when you're writing these blurbs, going through this process, creating a list of the major attributes of your characters, your plot, your setting, and your tropes, all 5 of those things. 4 if you only have one main character, 5 if you have 2, and I guess more if you write reverse harem. That gets kind of complicated. But you're creating this list because you don't want to get lost in the weeds. You want to stay focused on these major things that are happening in the story, and make sure that your blurb doesn't start wandering off into backstory or describing in detail certain events that don't really matter. You want to keep it, to the important elements. But you're going to end up with a lot of cool things that you wrote that just don't fit, and you're like, man, these are amazing. And these are things that you can use for ad copy, because you actually already wrote your ad copy. We just left it on the cutting room floor. So here's some examples. This one right here, yet another Saturday in the office. Sarah was used to working 6-hour weeks, et cetera, et cetera. So this initial version that I wrote of this, I would probably change this to present tense. Yeah, sorry, it's a past still. But I could actually use this as ad copy. And I could use this on a Facebook ad or something like that to capture people's attention, pull them in, and then when they read the full blurb, they're going to get the rest of the story now. But this one sort of grabbed them, and it ended on a bit of a hook. And maybe I would tweak that a little bit, make it a little bit shinier, but I have some cool copy that I could use for that. And ones like this, this is actually great ad copy. And this actually, I actually did a test with this one, and it worked really well for another author, actually. So you can just use some of the short, pithy things that maybe an earlier version of it, or maybe even just the version right out of your blurb. You just grab like a sentence in the middle of your blurb, and that can make good ad copy as well. And then lastly, this one here. could actually be ad copy to. This would probably need like an initial sort of tag in front of it, but just another example of what you can do. So there you have it. There's kind of the anatomy of how to write a blurb. And again, to sort of summarize, it's creating a list. Creating the way I do is I just like use a spreadsheet or a notepad, creating those 5 columns of information about your characters, about your setting and your tropes. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, if you're uncertain of like what the tropes really are in your genre and what you want to be conveying, TV Tropes is a great website that it's like the Wikipedia of tropes, and it's hilarious, the names that they give different tropes and stuff like that. So reading TV tropes can be a great way to really kind of get a feel for the tropes that are exist in your genre. But you can also just say like top 100 romance tropes, just search for that, and there are literally pages with lists of the top 100 romance tropes. And then you can look at it and say like, wow, my book actually has all of these tropes. And then you could, for example, then go look at the top selling books right now in your genre and be like, okay, here's all these 100 tropes that romance has, and all of the top 50 are exhibiting these tropes, or the majority of the top 50 are exhibiting these tropes, and I have those tropes. And those are some of the tropes you're going to want to focus on. And that's a great way for you to figure out exactly what you want to highlight. And then to be honest, like, most of our books have a lot of tropes in them. So as times change, and maybe you go and look at like, wow, everybody right now is writing about enemies to lovers. And there actually is an enemies to lovers element in this story. So I'm actually going to focus on that trope and rewrite my blurb to focus on that instead of another trope that was previously really popular. So that's sort of an element that you can use there. And then the basics of it, again, to remember, your blurb needs to start by establishing the status quo. You need to say what broke the status quo, and then what are they going to do to fix it, and what happens if they fail. And that's basically how you create the stakes, and you make people care about your own character. Isn't it amazing? This is like our job. We're going to make things up on our head and then say, like, hey, you want to give me money and then spend 10 hours reading about this thing I made up in my head? It's bizarre that this even exists. Right. So my wife and I, Jill, we do a lot of different things working with authors. We do Facebook ad training. We do work on blurbs and teaching blurb classes. We do a whole class on genre and tropes, where it's a 5-day class. We take you through in great detail how to dissect your own tropes and genre elements in your story, and how to dissect all the major elements in what's currently selling, to find the synergies, and figure out how to make your blurb and your cover and your tagline all work with that. We do stuff with launch plans and help authors build launch plans and teach that sort of thing too. So a lot of different things that we do, built on, between the two of us, we've released over 200 books in the last 10 years, and we've done really well doing that. So we want to share that with other authors, and that's why we're here. So thank you guys very much. And if there's questions, we have a little bit of time for that.
Thanks for this, it's wonderful. You mentioned often being in the present tense for your blurb. Should the tense of your blurb have a connection to the tense of your book, or is that actually irrelevant?
It's actually irrelevant. You really do want to write present tense blurbs regardless of the tense of your book, because it creates that sense of immediacy. But one thing I would recommend doing though is like go and look at the top selling books in your genre. What you're probably going to find is that 99% of them write present tense, but there are some subgenres where past tense is pretty common, so you can focus on that too. Yes, I love the colors in your outfit, by the way. It looks so cool.
Thank you. How would you signal to the reader if there are certain quirks in the book that they should be aware of, such as big multi-POV, sort of Game of Thrones style, or other things that might put readers off if they didn't know in advance?
So, I mean, it can be hard to layer, there's like things like that, and there's like triggers and whatnot. It can be hard to layer that into the blurb. You could possibly do a little bit of that by talking about like, meanwhile in, whatever XYZ is going on. That could kind of allude to a wide story. A lot of people actually will just write a paragraph after the call to the action, describing that, saying like, this is a massive, multi-POV epic fantasy story that spans, 10 characters in their struggle to do blah, blah, blah. And that works really well. Romance authors do a lot too. Like, this is, a reverse harem, happily ever after, bully romance, enemies to lovers. We'll just list all the tropes out, just straight out underneath that. And that's great. Also, if you can get tropey words into your blurb is the third most important thing when it comes to search results on Amazon. So we think we've got our keywords and our categories that we put in when we're doing our books. But when someone searches for something, which is how everybody operates on Amazon, they just search things in the search box, your title, your subtitle, and then your blurb are actually more important than your keywords and categories. So if you can get tropey things that you can people search for in there, it's really good.
So
So I have a question for longer series.
Mhm.
When you're writing blurbs for longer series, is there anything else that you would take into consideration, or would you treat them very individually like this with this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of when we think about blurbs, we are thinking about either standalones or book ones, where we're really trying to pull someone in the first time. I actually write 2 different blurbs for my books in long series, because I always I do pre-orders for long series, so when someone gets to the end of book 1, the pre-order for book 2 is already there, so they can just grab that pre-order. But I don't want the blurb for book 2 to spoil book 1. You know, so a lot of times I'll write a short kind of nebulous blurb initially, and then after the books come out, so on a pre-order, I'll do a better blurb. But I write that blurb in the long-running series for the readers of this series. I'm not writing it to sort of attract new readers. I want to make sure that they understand the escalating stakes that the character's facing, and that they want to then read the next book. I actually did this one series called Because Marauders, where she's like, it's a military story, but also a found family story and a bit of a revenge story as well. And I think book 4 was just a checklist. It was like, escape from slavery, done. This thing, done. And the last thing was like, kick Nietzschean ass, hangman, was the blurb. So you can have fun with it on a longer series.
Awesome, thank you.
So this might seem like a bit of a silly question, apologies, but is the blurb that you use on the back of the book different in any way to the blurb that you'd use, say, on your Amazon sales page?
Usually it becomes different. Initially, I have the same blurb on both, but chances are I'm going to be honing and refining the blurb that I'm using on Amazon or on my other retailers for my wide books. I don't bother going and changing the one on the back of the book, because really, like, no one's picking my book up. Very rarely is someone picking my book up off of a bookshelf and buying it that way. Even if they buy the print edition, they're buying it off of an online retailer and reading that blurb. So I don't really worry about that too much.
Because you wouldn't have the call to action on the back of your paperback, would you say?
Probably not, no. I don't think unless it was something I thought was really slick and wasn't too salesy, then I might put it in there, because I kind of want the back of I want my print books to be a little bit more like collector's items in a way, so I want it to be like a lot more prosy and less salesy and stuff like that. That's me. Certain books, like if you're writing nonfiction or you're writing middle grade or something like that, then a lot of your readers are actually going to be buying. A lot of them are people who are going to be buying for someone else, and they're buying print. So I might pay more attention to it on the print edition for those.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? Oh, look at that. I can't believe I finished another one early. This is like unheard of. So you guys are please be free. Bye.